So welcome to the Global Open Research Commons Interest Group and International Working Group combined session. We're going to be talking a little bit about the recommendations that we've developed, the implementations and profiles that we're looking to move towards, and also welcoming you to, in fact, the last working group meeting of the GORC International Model Working Group. The interest group will, of course, continue to live on, and what happens next for the working group side is what we're going to talk about today. So welcome and icebreakers. It wouldn't be a breakout session if we didn't do a Menti. So I'm encouraging you to either scan the QR code or go to menti.com and enter the code 43490801. And unfortunately, I also won't be able to show the result on screen, but I will try and narrate it a little bit because I'm able to see it on my phone here. So as you're scanning that or going to the link, the questions that we're going to be asking is, have you heard of the interest group or working group before? So we'll start with that one. Give people a moment and I'll say what's happening. And it may have cut out from people for a second there. I'm trying to make sure that it's playing. All right, so 10 people have said yes, 2 people have said no, and 1 is like, I'm not sure, question mark. Love that. So if you're just joining us, please feel free to go to the Menti. You'll miss the first question, but that's okay. We'll go to the second one. What sort of organization are you from? That's what you should be seeing now. Nice, okay. So we've got funders, we've got research institutes and universities leading the pack, service providers, and many other. Okay. Folks, and lots of thumbs up, I love that. For those that have said other, I don't know if anyone's here in the room or on Zoom, would you like to tell us what other kind of organization that you're representing? All right, still seeing a lead from research institutes and universities.
So I checked other because in addition to being employed at my university, we're working on the projects that university is doing, like the Go Fair US project. And then I have side gigs sometimes or personal things that I'm pursuing. So it all comes together in a big mix.
Nice, excellent. So a combination of things. Any other others that would like to speak up? Okay, so we'll move on to the next question, which is, what country are you based in? Oh, this one is not the right order, my bad, folks. Which country are you from? That should be what you're seeing now on Menti. We didn't have them in the right order. The UK, Sweden, Australia, France, United States, Canada. Okay, USA and United States have both been entered, which makes this extra confusing. Finland, Ireland, Chile. France and Canada leading though. Oh, Australia, United States leading. The Netherlands. Bethesda. California. Okay. All right, looks like it's getting pretty stable. So definitely a lot of folks from Canada, France, the United States, Australia, and she's changing again. Independent social sliver. Okay, you know what, we're gonna move past that, but definitely global representation, more so from North America and Europe at this time, but we're hoping to improve that um, as we go. But of course, realizing that with this particular time slot at a plenary located in Costa Rica, you're going to have a particular demographic. So the next one we're going to look at is what do you think of when you hear the word commons? And sorry for one person who said UK. Obviously, you meant to answer what country are you from? But we have community, resources, standards, best practices, network, parliamentary democracy, ooh, equity, love. Oh, wow. All right, there's a lot here. They all came in at once. Shared resources, specifically benefiting all, shared infrastructure, shared space, interoperability. All right, and we're seeing a kind of more in the word cloud towards standards, infrastructure, and community and interoperability. Standards is a close second. All right, and so we'll go to our last question, which is which areas are you interested in learning more about? And this is a ranking question. So you get to say like, I'm kind of interested in everything, but these are the ones that are a priority for me. So the options for those in the room here. So the first one that came in is mapping with relevant frameworks. Oh, here we go. Now we got some rankings. Visualizations was top. This is really flipping all over the place now. I'm going to give it a second before calling them out. All right, starting to stabilize. So it looks like to me that the first, consistently, some of the other ones underneath are changing, but implementation profiles for the GORC international model, followed by mapping, adoption support, and feedback, um, visualizations, yeah, expanding the scope and thematic slices. And so I'm going to leave that one up for a second for the folks that might need a little bit more time to rank. So I encourage you to keep looking at that because one of the things we want to highlight is what areas of work we do first. So thank you for participating in the Menti. I really appreciate that. And I'll also remind you to sign into the collaborative notes. The collaborative notes are in the session page. So if you go to Whova into this particular session for the GORC, IG, and working group combined session, um, the session page is linked in there. You go there, and I've added a comment on the RDA page of where the collaborative notes are. For folks that might be on Zoom, I encourage you, for folks in the room that are on Zoom, helping us facilitate a little bit, definitely send it in the Zoom chat and maybe even put it in the chat on Whova if you can. So please take a moment to sign into those collaborative notes. Let us know that you were here because we definitely want to make sure that we send you some of the outputs from this session. Okay, so introductions, and I'll start by introducing myself because we didn't have our usual picture of all the co-chairs up at the start. My name is CJ Woodford. I work for the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, and I'm one of the co-chairs for the interest group as well as the International Model Working Group. Our other co-chairs include Andrew Trillar from ARDC in Australia, Javier Lapisetti, who is part of the European Commission, I don't think he works for EOSC, but is highly affiliated with EOSC. Latero Matas, and he works with La Referencia between Spain and Argentina. He goes back and forth. And we're also fortunate to have in person Mikiko Tanefuji, who works with NII in Japan. So even though I'm going to be leading the presentation today and doing a lot of the talking, it is really the work of our co-chairs as well as our 86 to 89 members that we have and that have continued to be part of the interest group and working group over the span of the last few years. But what does that mean? So the Global Open Research Commons is this idea of interoperable commons or research infrastructures where research objects are seamlessly available to the researchers that need it to conduct research, as well as the services, tools, and support systems all under that framework of making sure that policies and security are accurately and adequately addressed as well. So not necessarily only open data. Open data would be, of course, like a main pillar of something like a global open research commons, but making sure that the commons itself is open to the people that need to use it and want to use it, even if maybe not all the services or platforms or data themselves are open. We're not saying that you don't need to have AAI. So the GORC interest group was founded to kind of address this idea of how do you get to a global open research commons? And they are tasked with developing a roadmap of how. They realized that before they could say how, they needed to address what. And so the International Model Working Group was founded underneath the umbrella of the interest group to work towards what does a commons or research infrastructure or other affiliated research thing need to consider to then be part of the GORC eventually, or maybe even a smaller version for their nation or a pan-national organization such as the European Open Science Cloud or the African Open Science Cloud. So the model was developed to determine the what might you consider. That feeds into the roadmap of how do you implement those considerations. And if we put all that together, we then are moving towards this idea of things using the same language to describe what they're doing and moving towards an interoperable system that works internally as well as interoperable externally. So the outputs that we have from this, the very first one that I want to highlight is the GORC interest group typology and definitions document. So this particular document came out, or rather was endorsed in July of 2023, so still relatively new, and they identified what essential elements a commons needs to be kind of considered a commons. Other types of research infrastructures may not have all of the elements, and that's okay. Not everything has to be a commons. But if you're a research commons and you're providing services and support at that level, you kind of need something in each one of these hexagons. And you can check them out at this particular link. And so a very quick introduction to some of these hexagons. The white hexagons on the top illustrate social or human aspects. They include things like your governance structures, your rules of participation and access, your definition of your commons in particular under governance structures, your engagement, sustainability, and human capacity. In the center is standards and conventions, which kind of ties everything together. And the blue hexagons on the bottom highlight technical aspects. ICT infrastructure, including compute, storage, network, and authorization and authentication infrastructure, your research objects, and of course the services and tools. So how this worked is that the typology came out first, or it started to be formalized first, and it fed into how we created the international commons model. However, as we were building the model and we had more people working on it with more and more time, especially for the task groups, we were having feedback into the typology as well. Not all of our definitions were as good as we wanted them to be. Not all the titles or the names of the essential elements were as encompassing as they could be. So there was a lot of feedback between the interest group and the working group. The typology, as I said, was endorsed in July of 2023. And after taking that first input into the model, we had 12 speakers. So commons that ranged from international or pan-national commons to national to regional to discipline specific. And they came and spoke to the working group and gave a lot of information about what their structure looks like, what their ambitions were, what their challenges were, and leading into that question. And so looking at their speaker series analysis, as well as all of the documentation they had that was visible, plus a phase 1 and 2 review, which included several hundred publications and pieces of documentation outside of the speaker series. That fed into what the model was built on and how we started to collate and aggregate information into what would a commons or research infrastructure need to consider to be part of a global open research commons overall. This went back and forth with task groups. So we had dedicated task groups looking at specific parts of the model. They took piles that belong to essential elements and worked through them systematically. And this led to a report. And the report and the model have both been endorsed as of October 2023. And as of a couple of days ago, the model version 1.1 has been endorsed as a recommendation because now we have formal adoption stories as well. There we go. So I've already mentioned a little bit of this, but I just want to highlight it on the screen as well. The model is what you may consider because we want to highlight that it's a non-prescriptive guide. It's in a spreadsheet container for now, organized by the essential elements and broken out into categories and subcategories with characteristics called attributes and features. There's an extended description, examples, sources, and consideration level for every item in this model. There's also a glossary and a list of just under 100 key performance indicators and metrics that we also found throughout this literature review and speaker series. The report is intended to be an accompanying document that gives a narrative overview of what happened and what we're trying to do. It's got a detailed methodology of what we did, a narrative summary of the model, the current and intended use, and areas of future work. And as I stated, there's a 1.0 version, but as of a few days ago, there's also now an endorsed version 1.1. So I highly encourage you to go check all of those out, but in particular, start at version 1.1 because that's the most recent and accurate. Going through the model structure very quickly, it is broken down into categories, or sorry, it's broken down into entities and characteristics. So our essential elements are at the top. Those are those hexagons we saw with the typology. They might have a characteristic. That characteristic and attribute might have a subcharacteristic called a feature. And then things are inherited from parent to child in our model. So if an essential element has characteristics, the category that belongs to it inherits it. And then if that category is a subcategory, those characteristics are inherited as well. And this is the spreadsheet. And yes, I know it's terrible. We all know that. And it's something that we really want to move. We really need to get it out of the spreadsheet format. All the data is in here. All the content and those hundreds, if not thousands of hours of work are in there. So it's all there, but it's not very easily used and it's not very easily searchable. And so this is what we need to work on next is how do we make it more usable? Because the content and the consideration and the work went into it. And we need to make sure that it maybe isn't wrapped up with a bow, but it's at least a little bit more aesthetically pleasing. So before I get into takeaways, this is a big introduction to all the outputs and kind of how things worked. And I want to take a second to see if anyone has any questions about our process, what the groups are, what the groups did, or what the outputs are for, how they were constructed. And we do have mics that can run around. Clear as mud, perhaps. But this is going to change, which I think is the hopeful tagline there. All right, so we've been having working group sessions and interest group sessions at plenaries for a while. The takeaways from the most recent one was that the typology of essential elements, all of our hexagons, are really useful as a discussion starter. Everyone looks at that and they're like, this graphic is great. A graphic designer created it, so it should be great. They worked really hard. And it's a good prompt for everybody, no matter what field you're working in relations to a research infrastructure or commons. There's something in that essential elements that'll prompt a discussion on your gaps, your priorities, and so on. The model itself is useful and people have used it. As we say, there are formal adoption stories, but it would be really benefit from some revisions, some evidence of relevance through framework mapping, the implementation profile, so actual examples of how people have implemented the model or used it in these discussions, and a more interactive friendly container, which is the main takeaway I've been having from every conversation I've had about this model. We also recognize that support for adopters is an ongoing need. It's not something that's one and done. And so showcasing the value and impact of using the model for various interested groups will help with that adoption support because maybe you're not someone who's developing in commons, maybe you're someone who's funding it, or maybe you're someone who writes policy around it, or maybe you're someone who works in the technical team. We want to make sure that it's clear how you can use the model from your various perspectives within the commons, either within it or outside of it, and how you're interacting with it. So what do we need to do? We need to revise it and submit it as a recommendation. That was the main to-do that we got out of P22, and we did that. We need to map it to relevant frameworks. We need to get support for making an interactive container, and we need a new working group to make adoption, to help with adoption support, implementation profiles, and so on. So the first to-do, done. Big check mark. I showed you a big explodey thing with it in the previous slide. We've got a recommendation. That's version 1.1. Mapping 1.0 the version 1.0 to relevant frameworks is something that was actually done over the summer by myself and a few other folks in a mapping task group, and we'll talk about those today. However, we have not successfully moved the content out of the spreadsheet, and we have not created a new working group. But I'm really excited to showcase that we are going to be sharing the case statement for that new working group today because the work continues. All right, let's talk a little bit about the adoption stories, however, so you know who they are. So the first, well, maybe not the first, sorry, I don't want to put them in order per se, but SURF in the Netherlands is a national level commons, and our colleagues Laurence and Martin were really instrumental in moving that adoption forward for SURF. They gave us a lot of really great feedback on how the model can improve, and they also found it helpful, especially for governance level decisions and discussions. I don't know if Laurence or Martin are online. The Netherlands, so I think they might be. Sound off if you're online, Laurence or Martin. Okay, maybe not. I was hoping they might say something. That's all right. The other adopter of the model formally is Reason, which is a proposed infrastructure for Norway. And the adoption here was led by Philip Kanzet, who's a research librarian at UIT, and Rory McNeil, the CEO and founder of R Space. And Rory's leading another session right now, because otherwise he'd definitely be here talking about it. What they used it for in particular was creating a funding proposal for their national level research infrastructure that they want to see. And some feedback we got from that is it was really helpful in making sure they could meet that funding proposal timeline. It helped them organize and categorize things and get it done more systematically. And it also helped them really nail down and make a more detailed proposal so that they're more likely to get funded. The result of that hasn't been confirmed, but fingers crossed. All right, so that's a little bit of the adoption story. So all of this is kind of things that have already happened. The work has already been done. We're there. What's happened in the meantime? So one of our interim outputs that we wanted to have to showcase for this plenary was mapping with other frameworks, models, principles, and vocabularies. The GORC model is very, very large. It's got about 400 considerations in it, and it pulls from many, many different resources. So some of those resources we can map to and say, this is like a one-to-one comparison, or this is like a parent-child relationship, or this is a synonym. And we haven't quite gotten into that nitty-gritty yet, but we have done some high-level mappings of things that were in high importance within the GORC working group. So the first one was mapping with a data mesh vocabulary. So this is the name of the publication, an annotated glossary for data commons, data meshes, and other data platforms. Obviously highly relevant. This was published by Bob Grossman, and it is essentially just a glossary. But that glossary is very specific and provides a lot of good terminology that was not actually in the GORC model at all. We used the word, but we didn't define it. So what we ended up finding is that it was most relevant to the technical elements. So not a whole lot going on for governance and engagement or rules of participation, although there were some connections there within that glossary. There weren't any new concepts, and I think that's important. What that highlights to me is that the GORC model captures all of the main big ideas, but where this is helpful for this mapping is to determine where there might be more granularity needed, or where we needed to add more definitions because we assumed that this word or this phrase was known by the wider audience. So definitely some areas where we can make things more granular or include better examples or actually put in a detailed glossary item. And what we also realize is looking at the way things were organized in this glossary, how the idea of data meshes might be influencing the idea of commons and vice versa, is that we might need to actually restructure part of the GORC international model, in particular the services and tools category or essential element. And so that was some really cool findings just from that one mapping. There is okay, obviously not in this version of the slides. That's brutal. Oh no, in the notes of this particular slide, you will see a link to a Google Doc where the whole mapping is visible to you. That's where it is. I didn't put it on the slide directly. Questions about this particular mapping or why we did it or what this vocabulary even was? Any questions from online so far? Oh, Ida, yeah, there's a mic coming.
Hi, yeah, so I'd love to hear more about that last part, that several items should be reformatted. What do you mean by that? Like, what was the issue with the mapping there?
Yeah, so the issue was that some of the concepts that really came up a lot in the glossary were very prevalent and had like their own specific item in the glossary and this sort of thing, were kind of stuck in examples for bigger concepts within the model. And so it was this realization of like, okay, well, maybe we don't maybe we don't have things in the right part of services and tools. Some things that might be considered characteristics are more like categories, or maybe they need to be brought out into their own space entirely. Um, and other things where it was more like, we've got these two concepts in these two different categories, but they're actually highly related. So maybe we need to merge some concepts together to make it a little bit more obvious. So it's that kind of that kind of consideration where we need to think, what level of granularity do we need, and reorganizing how we have things placed within categories and subcategories respectively. I don't see any other hands. Oh, is that a hand? Nice.
So I haven't had a chance to read through this. I'm really excited. But I'm curious, have you done the mapping against the data space protocol and the work that's going on with the international data spaces? And if not, that's okay.
So this is the only mapping we've done that I can share. There's more that I can't share, but this is the only one that's public because the other two mappings we've done ended up not being mappings at all. Neither of them were with that particular output. However, something I'll also get into is we want to continue a literature analysis and determining what makes sense to map to or from, or consider how they work together. And that particular list may very well have that item in it, but it's a list of about 600 things that need to be reviewed. And I don't remember, sorry. But I would encourage you in the collaborative notes to put a link to it, and then I can absolutely make sure that we have it on the list. Thank you. All right, so other types of mappings that ended up not really being mappings. So Maldreth is mapping the landscape of digital research tools. What is the H? Did I miss it? I feel like I missed something in that acronym. Harmonize, okay. Sorry. um, and it's a map of the landscape for digital research tools, and that includes reinnovation of the research data lifecycle and where research tools fit in that lifecycle. So their session is called Reports and Plans. Reports and Plans, and it's going to be in the last breakout session, I think, on Thursday. Yeah, nice. All right, I remember some things. And so I encourage you to go look at that. They're going to have a new working group and everything. But what was interesting and really great is that some of the co-chairs and very active members of this working group were also part of the GORC working group, and it was immediately obvious that we had some overlap or points of complementary work. And so this was an obvious choice to look at mappings to say, like, does Maldreth really need a second working group? Does GORC need a second working group? Can we just all like go to one place? And it was determined that we actually do need two separate places because we can map some items, but it's not a great fit because we have two different audiences, scope, and granularity. So we're talking about two different problems that happen to be related, which means that they're areas of completely complementary work, but separate. So it's not so much a mapping between them to say, oh, this is like the mapping and you can use one or the other as long as you've got the mapping. It's more so you can use one, and then when you've got questions that fall outside the scope of it, you can then move to the other in a complementary fashion. That's kind of what we found. And an action that came out of this is to work with the Maldreth working group, or the second version of it that will be introduced on Thursday, to see how our outputs can be used together more cohesively. And so this is an exciting piece of work because it means that it's going to be one of our first instances of having a liaison between two active working groups instead of having its own separate working group. So kind of like a liaison task group between these two pieces. Questions about this? Because this was kind of like a mapping that turned into a whole other project. And the last one that was a mapping that was attempted, and it was a little bit, I'm going to say attempted in the way that it was done, but we realized that it wasn't quite right again. So this was with the trust principles for digital repositories. If you haven't heard of the trust principles before, they're often said in the same consideration as fair and care, but they're really more specific on the digital repositories technical aspects. And they stand for transparency, responsibility, user focus, sustainability, and technology. So a high level mapping was possible with the essential elements and the trust principles, which is very interesting, which means that you can kind of say, if I want to target something in the trust principles, I can look at these specific essential elements to get a better implementation of them. However, it was better to consider them as a slice. So not so much if I do these things, I suddenly have a trustful digital repository, but more so to say that these items in the model that cut across all of these essential elements support one or more pieces of the trust principles. So you're cutting across essential elements, taking a slice out of it, as opposed to mapping directly one-to-one. And so the action here was to consider thematic slices for principles and specifically starting with trust. But the high level mapping is something that we wanted to show, and in particular where you can find a heavier focus or higher aspect on transparency, responsibility, user focus, sustainability, and technology across all the essential elements, but realizing that really what we need is a slice across all of them to fit into each one of these ideas. So for anyone who can't see the screen, for transparency, it was highly related to governance structures. Responsibility was highly related to rules of participation and access, services and tools, research objects, and standards. User focus was really heavily influenced by human capacity and engagement. That shouldn't be surprising. Sustainability mapped to sustainability, which I feel like maybe you could actually map with that one, but it's still a slice that needs to be taken across ultimately. And technology, of course, really emphasizing on our ICT infrastructure of compute, storage, network, and authorization and authentication infrastructure, and services and tools. I think what's interesting here in particular is the work that was done on this. Services and tools appears twice for responsibility as well as technology. Again, this is a very high level overview, and it was mostly discussion on this one on realizing that mapping principles didn't really make sense. But this is where we got it. So we've got 2 new avenues of work as well as a mapping from the interim work that we did over the last few months. Questions or comments about mapping with trust? Anything from online? Okay, great. Well then, moving from interim outputs, it's going to move into, oh, I had this here as a visual guide and then didn't use it. Sorry, guys. So now this gets into, again, this is the last meeting for the International Model Working Group, and we are now moving into the International Implementation Working Group, which I am so chuffed to have look like GORC 2 because it's also accurate. Yes, the acronym was on purpose. And so knowing that we've got some mappings, we had some action items taken from there, we've got recurring, re-mentioned, consistent issues that we need to address. So this working group is ending, but a new one will rise from the ashes. And so some deliverables that we have identified for this GORC 2 working group is what I'd like us to kind of discuss and think about today. It's gone through multiple rounds of working group meetings and a lot of co-chair discussion, but there's always something we're missing, so I'm hoping we can talk about it. High level deliverables, we want to look at implementations of the model. How do you actually use the model? What are the actual implementations of these considerations? So moving beyond just examples to say, in, I don't know, the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, this is exactly what this item looks like. And have hopefully a link or maybe a citation available to have evidence. And then do that for every single commons that we can create a profile for, or types of commons that we can create a profile for. But we need to figure out what types of commons there are first. So the first sub deliverable we've identified in here is the types of commons. We know that the National Data Services Interest Group, which is currently a BOF, but likely to come back as an interest group, is really interested in having a commons profile that specifically addresses what national data services should consider. And so this is another example of where we're hoping to see some cross-group work, some maybe like a liaison task group that sits across them, because that profile specifically for national services is really key and serves both of our groups' purpose. And then profiles of specific existing commons, like specifically for the Digital Research Alliance of Canada, specifically for ARDC, specifically for EOSC, specifically for AOSP, and so on. The next deliverable would be improved navigation and use of the model, which would include a better format, a better container. That includes things like introducing identifiers and semantic objects for the GORC model as well. So that's a really key first step in that deliverable. We also want to improve the documentation and communicate value narratives in an introduction package to help people actually uptaking that adoption. This will include model slices to say if you are specifically interested in how the GORC model refers to research data management, or specifically refers to persistent identifiers, or specifically looks at versioning, et cetera, you can take a thematic slice of the model that's pertinent to your role within your infrastructure, your organization, and say this is how we can use the model in this instance, helping with adoption. And lastly, the thing that we're leading in from interim outputs is model mappings and connections, not just mappings, because not all of them are mappings, to existing frameworks, models, vocabularies, and principles. So the idea really being that the model documentation, the slices, and the mappings, as well as the profiles, would live within that interactive web interface so that you can easily search individual items, but then also see what have other people done. What are some thematic slices that I can look at that's relevant for my role in particular, as well as how does it connect to something I'm already using in my organization or something that we were looking to use. And then lastly, to make sure that we're still updated with the expanding literature that exists on research commons, data meshes, fabrics, and everything else in between and above and below, we're going to continue working on our literature analysis. As I already previously mentioned, there's a lot of items that have been added from that 200 that went into the GORC model. So what does this address? This addresses providing a common language to describe commons. It improves the relevance and usability as well as the content. It provides, wow, that numbering didn't work. It provides examples of what implementations of commons can be through the profiles primarily, and it showcases where existing frameworks and models have gaps, connect together, as well as complement each other, including the GORC model. That's the plan. It's a hefty plan. There's a lot of work in that plan. And before anyone starts getting really wide and glassy eyes on how much work that is, I want to highlight that types of commons is a piece of work that's already been done. We need to formalize it. Profiles of specific existing commons, we've got 12 waiting in the wings from our speaker series that need to be formalized and approved. Format improvements through identifiers, semantic objects, that has already been done and needs to be taken up and finalized. Model documentation starts with the RDA Tiger support we already received for the International Model Working Group, and it moves towards expanding on it and then formalizing it. Model mappings is something that's already been started. I have quite the Google Doc on all of the models that need to be mapped. So we have a start, but that one's going to be hefty. And model slices already has work started on it for key slices that we've already identified, such as PIDs, versioning, AAI, security, and RDM. The literature analysis also has, again, a big list that we can start with, but in addition to that, we've already analyzed a number of these publications and other outputs that would feed into that literature analysis already. So even though this is a long list of things to do, a lot of it is started, drafted, or completed and needs verification. And so the point of these deliverables and the way they're formatted here is to really address the issues on the right-hand side and do that with the information that's been sitting, not dormant, but kind of waiting as we formalize the content of the model first. All right, that's my spiel. I'd like to open it up to the audience and the folks on Zoom. How do we feel about this statement? Are the issues in line with what we think that a GORC International Implementation Working Group should do? Do the deliverables make sense? Are they still too much? Or are there things that we're missing that we should include?
CG, I would like to say a few words about the national data service thing, if you allow me. It will not be long. I put in the chat that we have the second BOF of the national data services, which is on Thursday during breakout 6. And we will present the proposed charter of the IG, and it includes liaison with the GORC working group and the proposal to have as an output a GORC profile for national data services. Because of the diversity of national data services, we think it will be an interesting exercise. And when you say that you already have profiles for the series, the speaker series, there were several national data services among them. So it will be interesting to start from there and to see the commonalities and the differences. So I think it's a starting point, which is interesting. For the rest of it, I think I am ready to say that at least the second line of your D1, there is an agreement to go on with it from as a cross interest group, working group activity. I will not comment the rest of it. So it's not to say you have too many things or not, but well, at least one part is aligned with what we want to do.
Right, thank you, Francoise. And yes, highlighting that, and yes, BOF is coming up on Thursday, but that's an interesting point about looking at the existing profiles before the NDS profile. I had it the other way around in the timeline, but I can see the benefit of either for sure. Ida, yeah.
I'd love to hear more about some of the dependencies you might already perceive between the sub bullet points and which one you think maybe is the most crucial to get right because it would have an impact on the rest of the work.
Yeah, okay, so that's a really good question. And I appreciate that we are not seeing the timeline at the same time as these deliverables. And it is not intended that we do everything at the same time. So yeah, thank you for highlighting that. I'm gonna show the timeline real fast and then hopefully that'll maybe spark more discussion and also answer your question. I unfortunately thought it would make more sense to split them up by which main deliverable they're a part of the work is, but I think maybe it would have made more sense to do it by time piece, so bear with me, folks, sorry about that. Within the first deliverable, we see that it makes a lot of sense to determine what types of models there are, types of commons. That was a mistype on my part. So types of commons is something we want to determine first because then that determines how we organize all of the implementation profiles after that. The National Data Services profile and the speaker series profiles, I was thinking would occur at the same time. So like that work would continue at the same time. And before, Francois, you get too anxious about this very short 3-month window I've allotted for a National Data Services profile, that was kind of like my minimum estimation. And if it extends beyond that, that's not an issue, of course. It would just mean like the people would appreciate that it takes longer.
Yes,
but I was thinking at least 3
you
months.
know, the issue here is that there is a huge diversity in national data services. So it will not be straightforward to go to a model, I am afraid, but interesting.
Yeah, yeah. And then the idea with this bottom row for other profiles, these are ones that would have to be created. The idea being that in 1 month, the creation is happening, and in the second month, a draft is sent to that commons, as well as the working group to review and revise and think through. And then it continues like that for a total of 6 potential new profiles. For D2, we would start with the model container and the model documentation. The container we would really want to have right and done within 6 months of the working group starting. That is a considerable amount of work. I am not underestimating it, but I think that we would want to put a lot of resources on it first. So it's estimated to take 6 months, and we would want a interim version of that web interface at 4 months so that we can try it out, maybe start importing pieces of the model or importing some of the profiles we might have ready to see how it actually functions. And then say like, okay, publishing that model container, that interactive web interface at the 6-month mark or shortly thereafter. Documentation is something that would be updated throughout, and it has, time where it's going to have different versions being updated onto that interactive web interface. And then slices and model mappings follow the similar structure as the other profiles, where they are developed for a month and then the draft is shown the second month. It's revised, completed, a new one is started, worked on, showcased, revised, completed, and then moved on. So these follow kind of 2-month increments. And then the literature analysis would be a continuing piece of work. It gets updated back to the working group routinely, especially during that month where everything is being worked on, because there might be revisions to the model that are recommended from that literature analysis, which are really important if you're doing a mapping or a profile. And wrap-up communications happen at the end. So Vida, I hope that that answers your question, but definitely the most important things that I see and our co-chairs see in terms of the work plan is start with model types and the container and the documentation. The literature analysis happens kind of as an underflow at the bottom, and I've got a recommendation on how we split work after this slide, but that's kind of where we see it needs to happen first. The container needs to be the container nearly needs to get kickstarted so that we can put the rest of these things in it. Types of models that you can actually make those other profiles, and the literature analysis to make sure we're not falling too far behind everyone who's publishing work about it, frankly. All right, so that's the timeline. I realize that's like a lot of information too. Questions, any further questions about deliverables, timeline, all this stuff? We've got a lot of things on a lot of different slides. Question here in the room?
Mine might be just a super simple one. You didn't mention it, but did you already apply for like facilitation services through Tiger? As this is so much work and maybe this might be applicable to that opportunity?
That's a great question. So the question was, have we applied for facilitation services with Tiger? So the GORC International Model Working Group had Tiger support and was already approved. And what we're looking at right now is applying for all of the RDA Tiger grants that are open now until November and December of this year, because that's going to determine how much of this we can do and when the working group starts. Because facilitation services are really important, but then also potentially if we get the Cascade grant in particular, is putting dedicated people on that model container part and maybe even shortening that particular timeline would be great. So short answer, yes. Long answer, not just facilitation support. We want the whole bag of support. All right, we got a couple of questions in the room.
Hey again, so I have a question about adoption. Looking at the international model and this this kind of second working group iteration timeline. And this really comes from the perspective of a commons in development. There are many core attributes listed in that model. And when you think of adoption, can you comment for a moment as to like, do you see certification down the road where certification would require all the core elements? Or would there be a roadmap for those who are developing commons where these can be aspirational? I guess it's a matter of minimum threshold. How many of these do you have to meet and in what phasing to be able to be considered a commons that fits within this?
Ooh, okay, that's a really good question. And the first thing that I'll mention is the reason why we didn't make the model prescriptive or say that it's a benchmarking thing. And that's because benchmarking was actually part of the title originally, and it was taken out to really emphasize that we are not intending for this to be a certification body. It's not a certification tool. It's intended as a guideline of considerations that you can pick and choose what's essential to you. So the reason why we have core in consideration levels and then other ones say like optional and whatnot is because we're saying, okay, if you don't want to look at everything at once, you just want to look at, okay, what are the core considerations I should think about or bring to my governance bodies or my supervisor? You can just filter by that. Now, admittedly, most of them are core, and I do appreciate that. But those consideration levels are really intended like that, consideration levels. And it still very well will be, frankly, not even just if, it will be, that not every infrastructure or commons will have all the core considerations. It's actually not possible. Most of them are very specific implementations of things. So the point is to say, if you don't want to look at all 400 at once, filter by core and you've only got 325. It's actually, it is most of them still. But that's the only reason why that's there. So we are not looking at certification down the road. That is explicitly what we do not want to do. It is something that's been mentioned a lot though, so it is important to reference. In terms of the second kind of, or I'm not sure if it was part of your question or implicit, but the not only like looking at what you have now, but maybe what's down the road or an immediate concern, that's not obvious within the model itself because it's really just the content container. There's not a lot of functionality in it besides filters. However, if you read the introduction on the first page, there's one paragraph that says this is intended for Commons developers and other affiliated groups to consider as they're building, to think about what's a priority now, or what they already have, what's a priority now, what's a gap now, and what's something down the road, or is just purely not relevant. And that's more obvious in the adoption tool that we created, which is linked on our RDA webpage, which is still a Google Doc, but it has more functioning in it, where it will take you to consider everything starting from the essential element, and then the big pieces of categories, and then working your way down as you answer drop-down questions on, is this an immediate concern? Do I already have this? Is this a far away concern, or is this not relevant for me at all? And then it helps, it's almost like a choose your own adventure adoption spreadsheet in that way. So yeah, not within the model, but we've got other things that try and target that. But that would be a key part of this interactive web interface, is maybe a place where you could fill out your own profile, or like a dynamic way to track your progress. Maybe if you say like, this is what we wanted, this is what we want now, and then check it 5 years from now and say, how much of that did we actually deliver on? So we can use it like that, but it's certainly not intended for benchmarking from our perspective, but internal benchmarking, sure. Other questions, concerns, comments? Oh, over here, sorry. Yeah.
Hey, CJ. Blimey, that's loud. Hi, CJ. So Adam Bilesmore from JISC and co-chair of Maldworth, which has been mentioned. Thank you. I think one of the questions from the point of view of the really great work that we're doing is, how did you do it? And from the point of view of developing other RDA outputs which are similar or which are aligned with that Cyanogen process, is there any kind of documentation around the process and practice rather than the actual outputs itself? So, you know, that kind of way that, you know, as general in RDA, we spend a lot of time bringing expertise together and producing an output. So have you any kind of either current work or as part of the two guidelines for, you know, creating this work, and also then, sorry to tag on, the sustainability of that actual output, the kind of ways that it's curated, managed, and evolves? Thanks.
Yeah, okay, so I think, assuming that I understand your question, which is, you know, all these things that are in RDA that, you know, are complementary or overlapping, how did we make sure that we were addressing them appropriately, kind of, and like seeing where there's overlap and those common ideas appearing. So first of all of our methodology is very specifically detailed in that narrative report. So that methodology is there. All of the resources we use are explicitly listed in the appendices. And we've also got a live Zotero library where we've explicitly highlighted things that were key resources, so like cited in the model. So like all of that is there and you can go navigate it. But in a longer, more holistic answer, I'd like to mention that something I started when I first started working with this working group, and quick aside, I was assigned as a full-time research associate on the GORC International Model Working Group from August of 2022 until March of this year. So GORC was like my life for a year and a half. And it's still most of my life, admittedly. But so a lot of this work I can speak to because I did it. What I was doing on the back end as I was reviewing all of these RDA outputs, as well as other things in the literature landscape itself, was that there were a lot of similar recommendations or overlapping concepts. And as I started reviewing things, I actually did start building a map of, these are the pieces of this RDA recommendation that actually match this piece of this other RDA recommendation. and they both fall under the title of RDM or PID or what have you. So I actually did start that, and I got it completed for the phase 1 literature review, which was only, I think it was only like 49 or 50 outputs that I reviewed, and total that was RDA plus other things. And I did manage to get that mapping done. The rest of it, because we had to eat through so much literature to make sure the model was accurate and well represented before we wanted to have it, endorsed, I had to stop that mapping. It was essentially, it was something that we had to cut. However, all of the content from which that mapping can be taken up again is available and is part of my big, long, 250-page review documents, where I specifically listed for every single thing that we looked at what item in the model it was referring to. And if it was a new concept, I would then say, okay, this is a new concept. We now need to add something new. So a mapping exists of a very small set of things, but there's content and analysis to be done on the whole literature review that we did conduct. And that's actually part of my literature review process that will carry on into the International Implementations Working Group. If it'll get moved into a more formal mapping to say, like, these are all the connections between all the RDA outputs, I think I'm going to need to talk to RDA and say, okay, can we get some help? Yeah, with that specifically. So it's not an output in here. I would consider it more like, I hate to say on the back burner, Adam, I'm sorry, but like it's one of those things that it's on the back burner. It's not going to depreciate with time because like it's been done. It just needs to be put into a good container and actually like synthesized. Yeah, good question. I do know that there's lots of people interested in that particular area, but it falls off as we consider other things. So any other questions on the GORC International Implementations Working Group? So I brought back the deliverables and issues to address because the timeline is a bit bright, but we can also talk about timeline again as well. Also checking online, do we have any hands raised?
Hi, thanks for sharing this. It's really interesting. I know in the document it's got a lot of KPIs, and I believe that is for the people who are considering this model to like potential metrics for them to use. Are there any particular KPIs or metrics that you plan to use over this next phase to decide, is this working? Do people like, the updates that we're doing? Is this helpful? Kind of how do you plan to evaluate the success of this group over the next phase?
Oh, okay, that's very meta. Like you've collected all these metrics, now apply them to yourself. So how do we determine success of that? I think that it's too early. Maybe I shouldn't say it that way. We're not sure what those measurements look like at this time. And this is something where I think it comes across for a lot of RDA recommendations and outputs, is that if you look at something like view count, citation count, download count, like, is that really telling you how helpful that recommendation is? Maybe not. And so what you need to do is do more of that qualitative adoption story piece. And we have some of those, and we've talked with people who give us informal information about that. And so I think for us, it's less about metrics as it is about KPIs. And we did actually define them differently in the model. That's why I use both words. So a key performance indicator is kind of like a high level indicator where metrics can feed into it. And for us, as the GORC, looking at the GORC model and other outputs that will be created, I think what we would be kind of aiming towards is more of that KPI, and we don't know exactly what the metric part is yet. But that the KPI is it helping researchers access the resources and services and tools that they need to do research? And how we learn about that is better facilitated research commons at all levels. So we really get that from those adoption stories. So yeah, sorry, I know it's kind of like a
That's
roundabout
great.
answer.
It's not that I don't think it's going to be successful. I'm just trying to figure that out too. So I'm looking for any ideas that, you might have figured out about how you evaluate this type of holistic improvement.
Yeah, the best I got is adoption stories, which is unfortunately quite cumbersome and time consuming, but it's, I think otherwise you're just missing too much information and context.
Thank you.
Ida again, yeah. We still have the mic in the audience somewhere?
Last question from me, I promise. So you did a lot of literature analysis already. So do you actually have some recommendations for people that produce various literature or RDA outputs? Like, was there anything where you would open up a document and you'd be like, oh, thank God they did this. This will make it so much easier to work through this and make sense of it.
Yep. It was very obvious, very fast, that everyone reinvents the wheel all the time. So I think the first thing I would say is for folks that are working in RDA interest groups and working groups, is there another RDA group that has already done what you want to do or is so closely aligned that it might make sense to join forces? Or at least to look at their recommendations and outputs if the group is totally dissolved. I feel like we maybe don't do enough of that before starting a BOF. Or anything else actually. And for folks that write publications in this space of research commons, research infrastructures, and all the considerations that go into it. So how you might orchestrate your PID services or how you might look at cybersecurity. It's also kind of the same thing as you're reinventing the wheel and not looking around you to see what are things that people have already published or have used. And what I would say for folks in that community, like, no, I'm not expecting you to do a comprehensive literature analysis every single time you think of a cool idea, but it might be helpful to rely on bodies that kind of do that work of literature analyses like RDA. Yes, we've got a lot of outputs and recommendations, but a lot of them have pretty, like maybe not full, like systematic literature reviews in them, but a lot of them do, or they're quite close. So that would be my recommendation for folks writing publications in this space is like, really look at the RDA outputs page. You don't have to read everything, but just make sure that there's not something in a topic or with a similar keyword that you haven't considered, because it might very well be that the same list of 11 or 12 recommendations you're making has already been made by a group that ended 5 years ago. And that was something I did find repeatedly. And it's in that really long 250-page literature analysis document I mentioned on how much frustration I have with that sometimes. All right, we have another question in the room here. I don't know if we still have the mic.
Just looking at your glossary, the complexity and the rigor of the work that went into extending some of the terminologies in here. Has there ever been discussion about actually grounding an ontology to these terms? Because they're so in depth that in terms of making connections across these essential elements and standardizing even the literature analysis to be able to put that to an identifier, extend the synonyms, maybe, I mean, that could be a whole different working group, honestly, that's a lot of work too. But is that something that's been discussed from this Google Sheet?
Yes, so that's exactly what I meant by semantic objects in the first bullet point under D2, is what does a GORC ontology look like, or can we adopt a model that's already existent in the semantic object space that works for the GORC model to help with this? So that was work that had been done. There were some recommendations on how to do it, but we lost momentum and didn't finalize what that could look like. So one of those pieces, in order to maybe make that interactive web interface a little bit easier to use, is to have an ontology, or other semantic objects as they might arise from that work. I will say that the GORC glossary does exist as a machine actionable vocabulary right now through the ARDC. I don't think that's actually linked in the model, so that's something that we should change in future versions. But it is something that's also used by RDA for their internal catalog of recommendations and outputs. So we've kind of done a little bit of those first steps of that work, but that's exactly what we want to do within D2. All right, we're about 15 minutes left until the end of this session, and there was a couple more things I'd like to highlight, but I want to do one more last check. Are there any questions in the room or online about the deliverables, the issues we're addressing, or the timeline that we are proposing for this? Flip back to this one. All right, I don't see any hands, so thank you for all your questions and also for some of the comments and suggestions. Please do feel free to go in and look at the model. Some of you obviously are doing that now, which is fantastic. If you're looking at it on the Google spreadsheet version, that should be open to comment from everybody. So if you see something that you think should be changed or you've got suggestions for something, put in a comment. Like quite literally, that's going to be one of the first things we look at for revising the model is looking at those comments. Also, the collaborative notes that you signed into, please feel free to put ideas in there. We'd love to hear them and incorporate them into the next phase of work. All right, so I was supposed to discuss it on this slide, my bad. So we did the discussion on the other slides, but the point being here is that we're going to try and adopt the same task group structure that we had before. It worked really, really well to have dedicated, 4 or 5. In some cases, it was actually more like 7 people working on one area and then focusing really hard down into that area and getting a lot of really good work done. The versions of the outputs, as we already discussed, will be available for the other task groups to review and give feedback on, as well as the working group. And we are still planning, of course, to have monthly working group meetings as per usual with RDA working groups to review those intermediate outputs. So that's the plan. We're not going to have a speaker series this time. That's the one big change. We're going to be focusing more on the literature review for that external recommendation, as well as the folks coming to the task groups to give their recommendation and the working group meetings, but no speaker series in this particular iteration. There's too much other work to do besides having a whole new wave of information come in outside of that literature analysis. So the next steps, the GORC2 working group case statement is open for casual community comments. It's not like in the formal RDA community comments piece, but it will get there eventually. We'd like to submit it on November 30th. And at that point, we'll look to then formalize it for RDA submission after that. So you should be able to find the case statement document in the notes of the 3 slides that we were talking about the case statement for. So it's in there. And the idea in terms of timeline of when this really starts. So when does 1 actually begin on our timeline? We'd like to start the GORC2 working group in early 2025. There's some considerations between us as co-chairs on maybe should that work start in February because no one's going to be ready to start in January? Or is it something that should actually wait a few months and start in April? That's something that we'll need to consider as co-chairs and get a feel from the working group members as well to see when that begins. But we know that it's going to start sometime in 2025, so not that long of a run-up. But the case statement should still be submitted in December so that we can get a move on that community feedback. And as we already addressed in a question, we are applying for RDA Tiger support in November and December respectively for the GORC2 working group, starting in 2025. So we do indeed want all of the RDA Tiger support. I'm looking at Alex in particular. So that's our next steps. And it sounds like in particular from some of the questions we gathered, especially from Francois in Zoom regarding the National Data Services, BOF, and hopefully an interest group, we might need to think about rearranging the timeline a little bit on some of these profiles or semi-deliverables to make sure that they work for our liaison groups. And I'll also mention the mapping stuff will also be liaison with that Muldrith 2 working group as well. So we've got multiple groups that we'd like to liaison with and make sure that they work. And there's other groups in RDA that we're kind of starting those conversations with as well for liaisons in between. The other thing that was mentioned was expanding the literature analysis and mapping to some other outputs. So if you've got ideas for things, again, just put them right in the collaborative notes and I'll move them to the appropriate spaces so that we're ready to hit the ground running. And other than that, thank you so much for being in this session and giving us some discussion and ideas for the GORC2 working group. If you're interested in participating in any part of that work, and not all of it, I appreciate that we're not going to have one person on every single task group. That would be bananas. But if you're interested in any part of that, or even just getting a feel for what that could look like, please join the GORC International Model Working Group page. And what I'm hoping to do is migrate all of those members over to the International Implementation Working Group so that we can start in 2025. You're also very welcome to email me or any of the GORC interest group or working group co-chairs if you have any questions in the interim.